alaikum, welcome to Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm your host Kendra Cordova, and today we just have a short introduction to Shari'a, Jihad, and sort of the understanding of these scary Islamic or Muslim words. So if you're new to the channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. And some of the topics we're going to talk about today, I've touched on in length in some of our previous videos, especially those classes that I've given that are like those hour-long videos. So if you want to get in depth on some of these, I have covered them in longer videos, so go watch those next. So first of all, the word Shari'a. Okay, so whether you are a Muslim having conversations with other Muslims, or maybe you're just a non-Muslim who sees this on the news or is talking to a Muslim or watching, like a lecture from an Islamic scholar, whatever that is, words like that are going to start coming up. And depending on where you get these words from, you might have a different idea of what they mean. Today, we're going to be looking at these words like Shari'a from just an actual, what is the definition? And then looking at it from the different ways in which it is often used or implemented so we can understand why we get these like weird definitions that don't actually match the original definition. So the first one here is Shari'a. So a lot of people probably think Shari'a is a set of laws, strict, harsh laws about the way that everybody should dress and move and speak and eat, and that I often hear that, like Muslims want to impose Shari'a. So let's take a look at what it actually is. So the definition of Shari'a is the path to water or the way. It actually refers to divinely ordained moral and ethical frameworks that guide Muslims towards living righteously. It encompasses values, principles, and the totality of Islamic guidance derived from the Quran and prophetic example. So basically, how do you be a good person? Or how do you deal with others well? Or how do you connect with your faith? As opposed to actual set laws about that stuff, Shari'a itself is actually just divine guidance. Divine guidance that was given to us through revelation, through the Quran, and looking back and trying to understand the prophetic traditions. Sharia law, on the other hand, this is what you guys are usually talking about when you're talking about those sort of strict, legal rulings and things like that. And this is where things start to become complicated. So Sharia law is going to be the human attempt to codify or systemize and legislate based on interpretations of Sharia. So Sharia is, the faith tradition and Quran and what God has given us to guide us is guidance, right? And then Sharia law is humans trying to interpret that guidance and say, okay, well, this is what I think it means, and I'm going to make everybody follow it like this because that is the law I am making based on Sharia. But the problem here is that, this is where fiqh, F-I-Q-H, fiqh comes in. That's Islamic jurisprudence. Sharia is divine principle, but Sharia law is human interpretation shaped by context, methodology, and power structures. And so that's why you're going to get you could grab 100 different scholars and they could all have slightly different interpretation of something because it's imperfect. It's just the human trying to filter and use what they know to come to a conclusion and answer of how to best follow said guidance. But it changes based on who's doing it. And also very important to remember that power structures play a huge role. So these people are almost always going to come into the answer for how to follow the guidance or how they want to enforce what they think is the guidance based on the power structure that they're in. So if this new law that they implement gives them more power or control, they're going to be way more likely to interpret it in a way that helps them than to look at a piece of guidance or meditating on the Quran and the way to best help everyone, right? It's definitely, there's a lot of bias, so much bias when it comes to Sharia law. So you always have to look at who's interpreting it, who is trying to set up Sharia law, and why are they doing that? So strict and problematic laws emerge because of several factors. The first one is going to be harsh interpretations. So historical context preservation really plays into that. And that's the idea that classical rulings, like the original way that some of these things were understood, 7th to 10th century in Arabian tribal norms or medieval political structures that were around during like the pre-modern understanding of things like crime and psychology and, just like how to rule and understand how people work and all of that. They think that because it's the original version is the purest version, and therefore that's what we should go back to. That's where you're going to get a lot of those like strict hardline type, like Islamist type people, where they think that because it was done first, it's the best version and is therefore pure. And that's not even close to necessarily true, right? It was still heavily influenced and heavily biased based on who was doing it. And if you cannot update and you cannot take new information that you have and apply it to try to reframe and understand Shari'a, right? Then all of those Shari'a laws that they are putting in place are going to be outdated and archaic. And yeah, they're going to come across as just not meshing with how the world really is now as we know it. And they're going to come across as harsh. Especially in the way that the world is now. For example, like let me give you just a quick example. So like I used to live out in the desert, like the middle of nowhere, the desert, like no mailboxes, no police station, like the middle of nowhere. And in places like that, you do wonder like, oh, if something happens, like if someone tries to rob my house or if someone does assault me, like who do you call? What's going to happen? Don't say Ghostbusters, but like, who are you going to call? Like you could call, but they're going to be there in like 2 hours, maybe, and at this time they didn't have jails. Jails weren't a thing, right? So just trying to say that like, oh, the original way that they understood this in that context is how we're going to apply it to like, modern society it just doesn't work because the situation was very, very different than it is now, where I can like call the cops and they're going to be here in like 2 minutes, right? That's a completely different situation. Okay. Literalism and textualism is going to be another thing that causes, these crazy strict interpretations of things. So some schools prioritize apparent textual meanings without considering broader Quranic themes, prophetic intent, or changing circumstances. This approach often ignores the Quran and its progressive trajectory on issues like slavery and women's rights. So you'll hear Muslims that are like, oh, Islam was so great, it, stopped the whole like killing of female babies because that was a big thing, and we care about women and all of that. And yeah, but then they all of a sudden think that stopped back then. Like it's not a thing anymore. Like, no, it was meant to be progressive for not only its time, but within the context as we move forward. It is supposed to be a liberation theology. And yeah, if you just take the word for word instead of like taking it into context, like we've talked about in the previous classes, it just doesn't work like that. And then finally, there's also patriarchal interpretation and political instrumentalization. So patriarchal interpretation, that's going to be the idea that we talked about in some of our previous classes, that like if you keep asking the same exact demographic group of people for the answer, they're all going to get the same answer all the time because they only have one perspective. So if every single person that you have working on these issues is going to be like a male from the ages of like 20 to 40 that grew up in this very specific part of the world in a certain language and cultural group, you're always going to have the same answer. Not because that's the correct answer, but because you didn't get enough diversity of viewpoints, right? So if you're not thinking of it in any other way, you're never going to get a different answer. Then again, not because it's correct, like the only correct answer, but because you didn't try anything else. You didn't look at it in any other way, right? So we need to take that into account, right? Classical fiqh was developed almost entirely by men in patriarchal societies. So their gender biases became embedded in legal reasoning, right? And so they were like, well, I think like this, and this is how I see this, so that must be what God thinks. And then, they implement it out of nowhere. And then political instrumentalization, that's going to be that rulers throughout history have used strict interpretations to consolidate power. We talked about this a little bit in the last class, but if you look at the book, Reopening Muslim Minds? That is a really, really, really great book. Mustafa Akhil, he breaks it down as to sort of like how these groups in power started to just use it for their own good, right? It's very easy when you look at sort of like who is interpreting, if you are in a minority group, to be open and wanting freedoms for all and stuff, but then the moment that somebody gets into actual power, they immediately start finding like a scapegoat and just trying to use any kind of rulings they can to suppress the people beneath them so that they can gain power. This has been used throughout history, not just in Islam, but in every major like religion or belief system or lack of belief system or whatever. Once a person is in power, they will make that, whatever that identity is, right, the reason why they should hold more power. Also important to note colonialism. So colonialism sort of codified what we see now as like Islamic law as like state legal systems. And this happened as a reaction to colonial rule, and that became like rigid. So we've talked about the whole like psychological backfire effect is what it's called, where when somebody is presented with information or comments or whatever that is that goes against what their like strict set worldview is, they are not as likely to open their minds and change it as they are to immediately dig in even harder into what they believe. And this is called the backfire effect. So by being exposed to some of these new things, they could inadvertently start to become much more like, no, my side is so right that I'm going to dig in even harder. And so this isn't to say like that the people that were like colonizing places were like the good people or whatever, like no, like the colonization, all of that stuff, terrible, bad, right? But you can look at a version of this in the West, right? So like if you're in the West and you start to see this opinion that like Muslims aren't bad people, and look at the way that they're doing this other stuff, and look, this doesn't fit your narrative, right? Like me walking around as like a white, not married, right? So because people like to do the whole, oh, you probably became a Muslim for your husband, like, you know, if people run into me like that and I don't fit their narrative of Muslims, people get very defensive and start to become really like anti-Islamic. Like even if that was not the conversation, they just see me, and by seeing me, they immediately start to go into like Muslims are the worst. So this is sort of the same thing. So like if someone in who you see as your opposing side says something, even if it makes sense, right? Even if it's something maybe you should listen to, or you should at least think on, or maybe try to understand these different sides, groups are way more likely to just dig in harder into what side they're already on as sort of a reaction to that. And so colonialism, which came in and destroyed these these groups, these cultural groups, these traditions, all of this. So they came in and they just like took over and like wrecked everything, right? So of course you don't want to listen to what they're saying. But what happens then is that the idea is that so anything that the people on that side say is all the time bad, and everything we do is perfect. And so we're just going to like dig in and do all of that no matter what. And that does create strict, rigid thinking, right? That neuroplasticity we've talked about is like gone at that point. So let's give just a couple quick examples of these like different interpretations, from a traditionalist interpretation to a progressive interpretation. I do want to note, right, when it comes to this whole concept of interpretation, Shari'a law, right, or even like fatwas and things like that, which are just like rulings on what people think is the best way to interpret or understand the situation, it differs from scholar to scholar, right? And there are progressive scholars that are people of knowledge that have taken years and years and years and decades of their life studying Islam and going to all these other places and studying Arabic and doing all that. And so just because something is a common interpretation, it doesn't mean it is the only interpretation. And we need to sort of keep that open because, again, depending on who's doing it, they're going to have a different bias. And so we can't just say that, oh, well, this group has more people and therefore it must be the correct one, because that's doesn't make any sense. So just because a lot of people believe it, that's a logical fallacy. It doesn't mean it's automatically true. In the same way people used to believe that the world was the center of the solar system, or Earth is the center of the solar system. And they even killed scientists who thought differently. It didn't mean just because everybody believed it, it was true, right? And so same thing. So a couple examples are things like apostasy, which we talked about previously. So a traditionalist view is the death penalty for leaving Islam based on whoever changes their religion, kill him. Which again has no context around it until you take the time to put the context around it. Progressive viewpoints are going to be that the Quran explicitly states there's no compulsion in religion. That's Surah 2, Ayah 256. And prescribes no worldly punishment for apostasy. The hadith likely referred to treason during wartime, not private belief change. Many scholars note that the Prophet never executed anyone merely for disbelief. So again, context versus not context. Now again, if you are using Islam as your reason for being awesome and being in charge of your group or your country or your whatever, right, you're gonna basically try to silence any dissidents, right? And so people are going to take it and they're just going to be like, okay, how do I consolidate power by using this? So you're going to just grab a line or grab whatever you can, and then you're immediately going to be like, I'm going to take this exactly as it is and never think about it in any other way or hold any context around it, right? And so that's what happens there. Women's testimony is another one. The idea that in a traditionalist view that a woman's testimony equals half of a man's in legal matters. Progressive interpretations show that this is specific to commercial context where women in 7th century Arabia had less business experience. It wasn't as common. Other verses accept that women's sole testimony, the principle of justice requires equal treatment. The form adapts to context. And things like that. So again, context is going to be where a lot of progressives are going to get their interpretations, is they're going to take it and then they're going to go, how can I fit this into context? You can also see this in interfaith marriage. We have our new book that is out. I think my camera's slowly been turning. Sorry, y'all. Just noticed that. We have our new book, Between Love and Tradition, that was just published through Muslims for Progressive Values Publishing. I'll put a link to that in the description down there. It's called Between Love and Tradition, and it is basically a compilation and an anthology of answers from progressive Muslim couples that are either one of them is Muslim and one of them isn't, interfaith couples, right? That Muslims for Progressive Values actually helped to do their ceremony. So we asked them all these questions, common questions about being in an interfaith relationship. They answered, and we put it into a book. So if you are like myself in an interfaith relationship, I'm engaged to a non-Muslim, or whatever your situation is there, it's an amazing book that's going to have lots of advice for you. It's like talking to a friend. It's like asking your friend these questions and then they give you what they think. So it's really great. The link to that is in the description here. But then also things like jihad. So here's another word here that I want us to cover really quick in this video. So jihad, right? We see angry militants and things like that. So let's learn what it actually is defined as and how it sort of has these different versions and how we got to look at it the way that we do. So jihad means struggle. It means a struggle, right? Trying to overcome whatever that struggle is. Traditionalist view takes on what is called in Islamic tradition the lesser jihad, meaning not as important, not as great jihad. And that's offensive military expansion, right? Bringing people under Islamic rule. That's what you're going to see from those people now. However, in the Quran, it only permits defensive warfare, right? If you look throughout the whole Quran, any of those places that are talking about war and stuff, you're going to notice it immediately goes to if they give up, you are to stop fighting them and you are supposed to be just towards them and all of that, right? In fact, the greater jihad, as it is called in Islamic studies, greater jihad, meaning the more important jihad, the best jihad thing you should be focusing on is a spiritual struggle within yourself. So jihad was really supposed to be about your own personal struggles with your faith here. And then if you notice in the lesser jihad, it's really just there as fighting to protect something important, protecting, Muslims protecting themselves from harassment and offense and like offensive, like military actions and aggression and all those other things. But it's not considered that important as far as like jihad goes. That's not what it was talking about. It's talking about greater jihad, which is an internal spiritual struggle. Okay, so let's understand some progressive Muslim approaches to these ideas. So progressive Muslims generally employ several interpretive principles. That's going to be distinguishing divine principles from historic applications. Again, what did it actually say, and what is the context? Who interpreted this, and why did they interpret it the way they did? We need to look at all of those things. There's also the objectives of Shari'a, right? The maqasid al-Shari'a. So that is the idea that Shari'a is basically supposed to only be used for these very important things. There's going to be the preservation of life, intellect, religion, lineage, and property, plus dignity, justice, and mercy. So the goal of Shari'a, meaning that guidance, is supposed to be protecting those things for people, right? Progressives also, that there's progressive revelation within the Quran, right? So noticing that the Quran is about taking care of those who have not been taken care of, right? Looking at women's rights, looking at the way that people were mistreated when it came to warfare, change in the way that people are treated and the way that slavery is viewed was throughout that whole thing. Just all of those, the orphans are like a huge one in there, right? Like people that have been sort of left behind in society and people aren't paying attention to and taken care of. The Quran was there to protect those people. And so when we talk about Sharia, or people talking about trying to develop Sharia law or laws based on that guidance, remembering that it was a very progressive faith. It's a very progressive liberation theology, and it needs to be treated as such. Contextualization is another way in which progressives are going to try to make sure that we stay where we should, instead of just grabbing things and being like, well, it worked 500 years ago, should work now, right? Like, you have to contextualize. Who said this? When did they say it? Why did they say it? Does it even apply right now? And things like that. And then ethical primacy. So centering the Quran's overwhelming emphasis on mercy, justice, compassion, and human dignity, right? Technical legal reasoning must serve these ethical ends. Ijtihad, which we've talked about, is another one. Independent reasoning. This means that people can still engage with this without having to be told what it is that they're supposed to believe by any other human, because Allah gave us the Quran, and that was the point, right? It was supposed to be for everyone. And so we need to engage with it personally, and we need to take our own understandings and try to reflect on them. We shouldn't just follow like sheep behind someone who says they have all of the answers and just decide that that's how we're gonna not only develop our relationship with Allah, but how like we're gonna treat other people and live in the world based on what this other person came to as a conclusion, right? So remembering to take the time to learn about it yourself, which is why we're here, right? We are here in these classes to learn as much as we can and open up our minds and try to see how we can better understand and better live as progressive Muslims, or just, obviously Muslims in general. So don't forget to like and subscribe. I will have some more videos, inshallah, coming out soon. Leave some comments. Let us know if there's other questions you guys have that you want us to cover. And inshallah, I will see you in the next video. Bye.